The guns fell silent, but the wounds remained. History was far from over.
The war was over. The conflict was not. For the first time in months, the land was quiet. No artillery, no fighter planes, only smoke drifting across a landscape that would never be the same again. To the world, the war had ended. For the people who lived here, history was only beginning. Across the hills, entire villages stood abandoned. Doors remained open, meals still rested on tables. Clothes hung from washing lines, waiting for families that would never return. The roads began to fill, not with armies, with people. Parents carrying children, children carrying memories. Old men walking beside carts filled with everything they still owned. Most believed they would return within days. Few imagined their journey would last generations. By the end of the war, more than 700,000 Palestinians had fled or been displaced. They crossed into Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, the West Bank, Gaza. Rows of tents appeared across the Middle East. Temporary shelters slowly became permanent homes. Palestinians would remember these events by a single word: the Nakba, the catastrophe. Every conflict creates two memories. One remembers victory, the other remembers loss. While one people searched for a place to return to, another believed it had finally found one. Ships arrived day after day, carrying Jewish immigrants from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Some had survived the Holocaust. Others had fled persecution in lands they once called home. One land, two beginnings, each carrying its own truth, its own grief, its own hope. A nation now had to be built. Roads, schools, hospitals, an economy, an army. Because although the shooting had stopped, peace had never arrived. A ceasefire ended the fighting, not the conflict. It was drawn almost as a temporary military line. Yet that simple stroke of green ink would shape the politics of the next 70 years. The Green Line. The land stood divided. Gaza under Egyptian administration, the West Bank under Jordan, Jerusalem split in two. Barbed wire crossed ancient streets, concrete divided neighborhoods. Families who once lived only minutes apart could no longer reach one another. Some Palestinians crossed the border hoping to reach abandoned homes. Others crossed to launch attacks. Israel answered with military reprisals. Every funeral became tomorrow's reason for another funeral. The war had ended. The cycle had not. Far to the south, another voice was reshaping the Middle East. His name was Gamal Abdel Nasser. Across the Arab world, he spoke of unity, of dignity, of reversing the defeat of 1948. To millions, he became hope. To Israel, he became a warning. Then, another conflict erupted. Not over Jerusalem, not over refugees, but over a narrow strip of water that connected continents, the Suez Canal. The conflict was no longer watched only by its neighbors. Washington was watching, Moscow was watching, the whole world was watching. For a while, the guns grew quieter, but silence can be deceptive. Israeli children grew up believing their country's survival could never be taken for granted. Palestinian children grew up hearing stories about homes they had never seen. Both inherited memories that were never theirs. By the 1960s, the ceasefire existed only on paper. Border clashes returned, military alliances strengthened. Every government claimed it was preparing to defend itself. Its neighbors believed it was preparing to attack. For the first time, Palestinians were no longer waiting for Arab governments to speak for them. A new movement emerged. It called itself the Palestine Liberation Organization. The conflict was changing. It was no longer only a struggle between nations. It had become a struggle between two peoples who both believed this land was home. Nobody knew it then, but the next 6 days would reshape the Middle East forever. The spring of 1967 felt different, not because the fighting had already begun, but because everyone believed it soon would. Egypt moved its army into the Sinai. United Nations peacekeepers were told to leave. Then came another announcement. The Straits of Tiran would be closed to Israeli shipping. For Egypt, it was a show of strength. For Israel, it crossed a red line. Across the Middle East, radios spoke of victory before a single shot had been fired. Inside Israel, reserve soldiers kissed their families goodbye. Schools emptied, factories slowed, air raid shelters were prepared. Many feared the nation itself might not survive another war. Then, before sunrise, Israeli fighter jets lifted silently into the morning sky. The battle was decided before most soldiers had fired a single shot. Within hours, much of Egypt's air force had been destroyed while still on the ground. The balance of the war changed in a single morning. What followed became one of the fastest military campaigns in modern history. Israeli forces swept across the Sinai Desert. To the east, they entered the West Bank. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the battle reached Jerusalem. Street by street, soldiers fought through the ancient city. Then they arrived at the Western Wall. Some soldiers cried, others simply stood in silence. History had returned them to a place their ancestors had only dreamed about. But while one people celebrated, another watched its future grow even more uncertain. The fighting spread north to the Golan Heights, and almost as quickly as it had begun, it was over. 6 days, that was all it took to redraw the map of the Middle East. Israel now controlled the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights. Maps had changed in 6 days. Memories didn't. And memories are far harder to redraw. For Israelis, the victory became a symbol of survival against impossible odds. For Palestinians, it marked the beginning of military occupation. Hundreds of thousands were displaced once again. Millions more found themselves living under a new authority. The war had lasted less than a week. The occupation would last for decades. The question was no longer whether Israel would survive. The question had become, what would happen to the land it had captured? No government had an answer. No peace agreement followed. Instead, history turned another page. Wars can end. Conflict can continue. Across the West Bank and Gaza, occupation was no longer a headline. It became everyday life. Checkpoints, permits, military patrols. A generation of Palestinians grew up believing none of it was temporary. Meanwhile, Israel began building settlements across parts of the occupied territories. Supporters believed they strengthened security and reflected deep historical ties to the land. Critics warned that every new settlement pushed peace a little farther away. The battlefield was changing. It was no longer fought only with tanks. It was fought with roads, homes, maps, and competing visions of the future. Then, history delivered another surprise. Not because peace arrived, but because war returned on the one day Israel least expected it. On October 6th, while much of Israel stood still, the war returned. It was Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Across the Suez Canal, Egyptian forces advanced. From the north, Syrian tanks rolled toward the Golan Heights. For Israel, the surprise was devastating. The confidence, born in 1967, vanished in a matter of hours. Families waited beside their radios. Cities prepared for the worst. Thousands of young soldiers never returned home. When the fighting finally ended, no one truly celebrated. Israel had survived. Egypt had restored its pride, but the cost had changed everyone. For the first time, peace seemed possible. Then, the world witnessed something extraordinary. The president of Egypt stepped onto Israeli soil, not with an army, with an outstretched hand. Anwar Sadat walked through Jerusalem, where no Arab leader had gone before. If enemies could stand under the same roof, perhaps history could still change. Soon after, 3 men sat around a single table. Anwar Sadat, Menachem Begin, Jimmy Carter. 13 days, 1 table. Decades of distrust sitting between them. When they finally emerged, they carried the first lasting peace between Israel and an Arab nation. Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula. Egypt recognized Israel. For the first time, a war ended with a signature. Yet one question still remained. What about the Palestinians? For millions living in Gaza, the West Bank, and refugee camps, very little had changed. Occupation continued, settlements expanded, frustration deepened. Then the streets erupted. Young Palestinians filled the streets. Some carried flags, others carried stones. For the first time, millions around the world watched the conflict through the eyes of ordinary families. Quietly, far from television cameras, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators began meeting in secret. Months later, the impossible happened again. On the White House lawn, 2 lifelong enemies shook hands. The Oslo Accords did not promise peace. They promised a chance. For one brief moment, the future looked different. But peace is never built by signatures alone. Trust takes years. Fear takes seconds. Bombings returned. Violence returned. So did anger. Then, one bullet changed history. Not on a battlefield, at a peace rally. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli extremist. Sometimes, peace dies with a single bullet. The dream didn't disappear. It became harder to believe. Before long, the region was falling back into the only language it had spoken for generations: war. The Second Intifada would prove even more violent than the first. Suicide bombings struck buses, cafes, restaurants, and crowded city streets. Israeli forces launched major military operations across the West Bank. Helicopters filled the skies. Armored vehicles returned to the streets. Cities became battlefields, and once again, ordinary families paid the highest price. As the violence continued, another barrier began to rise, not made of diplomacy or trust, but of concrete. Israel began constructing a security barrier, arguing it was necessary to prevent future attacks. Supporters pointed to a sharp decline in suicide bombings. Critics argued its rout deepened Palestinian hardship and divided communities. Then came another decision that surprised the world. Israel announced it would leave Gaza. Every soldier, every settlement, gone. Homes were dismantled, military bases abandoned. For some Israelis, it was a painful sacrifice. For many Palestinians, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter. One chapter closed, another had already begun. The following year, Palestinians went to the polls. Hamas won the parliamentary elections. It was a result few had expected. Tensions between Hamas and Fatah quickly spiraled into violence. Within months, the Palestinian territories were divided. Hamas took control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority continued governing parts of the West Bank. One people, 2 governments. One conflict now divided from within. Israel, together with Egypt, tightened restrictions around Gaza, citing security concerns and the threat posed by Hamas. Supporters argued it was necessary to stop weapons from entering Gaza. Critics argued it also trapped more than 2 million civilians in an increasingly isolated territory. The result became painfully familiar. Rockets from Gaza, Israeli airstrikes, a ceasefire, then the cycle began again. Years passed. The headlines changed. The pattern did not. Children on one side grew up learning the sound of warning sirens. Children on the other grew up watching the sky for aircraft. Two childhoods shaped by the same conflict. Then, before dawn on October 7th, 2023, everything changed. Thousands of rockets filled the sky. At the same time, Hamas fighters crossed the border. Communities were attacked, military bases were overrun. A music festival became a scene of horror. According to Israeli authorities, around 1,200 people were killed. More than 200 were taken hostage into Gaza. Within hours, Israel declared war. The world watched as the conflict entered its darkest chapter in decades. Airstrikes began almost immediately. Soon after, ground forces entered Gaza. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Tens of thousands of Palestinians have been killed during the war. Hospitals struggled to function. Families searched through broken concrete for those they loved. Millions were displaced. The humanitarian crisis captured the world's attention. Governments argued, protests filled city streets across the globe. International organizations called for restraint. World leaders debated how peace could ever return. Yet beneath every speech, every headline, and every political argument stood ordinary people. Parents, children, families, trying to survive. More than a century has passed. Empires have vanished. Borders have moved. Kings, presidents, and prime ministers have come and gone. Wars have been fought. Peace has been promised. Peace has been broken. Yet the conflict remains. Today, a child born in Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, or Gaza inherits a story they did not begin, a story written long before they were born. Perhaps that is the greatest tragedy. Not that history happened. History is filled with conflict. The tragedy is that every new generation is forced to inherit it. The people who first fought this conflict are gone. Many of the leaders who shaped it are gone. But the consequences remain. Every border carries a memory. Every city carries a scar. Every family carries a story. For some, this land is the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream. For others, it is the home they believe was taken from them. Both memories continue to exist. Neither disappears simply because the other does. And perhaps understanding that is where understanding the conflict truly begins. History doesn't choose sides. It records what happened. Understanding why it happened and why it continues is left to us. Because history remembers the battles, the people remember the loss. And until both memories find a place in the same future, this story will remain unfinished. This was not the story of heroes or villains. It was the story of two peoples whose histories became inseparable, a story still being written. Somewhere between memory, identity, faith, and hope lies the answer the world has searched for more than a century. Until that answer is found, the land that so many call holy will continue to carry the weight of history.